This is Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, the discoverer of pulsars. She started her career at Cambridge, helping build a radio telescope with her advisor, Tony Hewish. The telescope is about the size of 57 tennis courts, and she was largely in charge of the 120 miles of wires and cables. It took 2 years to build, and when it was completed in 1967, she got to reading data looking for quasars, which had been discovered in the 50s. She had the sole responsibility for operating the telescope and analyzing the data, which came printed by a 3-track pen recorder on chart paper. And it printed about 100 feet of this chart paper a day. She would look over the log and log where she saw quasars and man-made interference. But every now and then she would see something that she described as a bit of scruff. It was a 1/4 inch of enigmatic data buried in miles of paper. And after she saw it a few times, she brought it to the attention of Tony, who dismissed it as radio interference. But she wasn't convinced that he was right and found it again after a month of looking. This time, she was able to tell that the signal was a string of equally spaced pulses coming in every 1.3373 seconds. And old Tony's like, that settles it, it must be man-made. But again, Jocelyn was like, you sure about that? And ran test after test. She determined that it wasn't the fault of the equipment and it couldn't be man-made because it was coming from somewhere 200 light years away. And nobody had ever seen anything like it before. She said because it was rapid, we could put a size limit on the thing, probably about 20,000 miles across. And that's way too small to be a star. But also because the pulse period remained exactly the same without ever slowing down, it was an object that must have had great reserves of energy, so it's gotta be big too. And they couldn't make no sense of it. In hindsight, we know that they were looking at a rapidly spinning collapsed core of a star gone supernova called a pulsar or neutron star. And neutron stars are so dense it would be like if every human on Earth were packed into a space the size of a thimble. Then she went on to find 2 more pulsars, confirming that it wasn't a fluke and she'd found a new population of astronomical objects. And then a paper gets published with her name second after Tony, and the media gets interested. And Tony jumps into the spotlight and takes all the real questions. Meanwhile, Jocelyn gets asked how tall she is and what her measurements are, and photographers even asked her to undo some buttons. And Tony doesn't do shit about it, and fuck him for that. Then little Anthony, I'm not a big fan of his, accepted a Nobel Prize with the head of their department for the discovery of pulsars in '72. For his part, Tony explained himself in a New York Times documentary. When you plan a ship of discovery and somebody up the masthead yells, "Land ho," that's great, but who actually inspired it and conceived it? There's a difference between skipper and crew. Personally, I don't really care if giving credit to the person in charge is regular science shenanigans. It's bullshit and people deserve credit for their work. Pasteur did it to his underlings and fuck him for that, and fuck Thomas Edison too. Ultimately, through grit and strength of will, Jocelyn endured, but she doesn't want minorities and women to have to go through what she went through. So she decided to use a £2.3 million physics prize that she won in 2018 to establish the Bell Burnell Graduate Scholarship Fund. And its purpose is to help women, minority, and refugee students become physics researchers. She's a champion.